Welcome to today's episode of If You Can't See. I'm your host Ariana, and today we're talking about cooking and baking. Picture frying an egg with a blindfold on. It kinda changes things, doesn't it? Today's guest will tell us all about how you can do all sorts of things in the kitchen, even if you're blind. Let's start with cooking. This is Jacob. He is my partner. He cooks every day and he happens to be blind. Let's start by talking about something that everybody does every day. Spreading peanut butter on toast. And I've heard from many blind people that this is a task that can be kind of difficult to do. So my first question to you, Jacob, would be, how do you spread peanut butter?
It's easy if you're okay with looking very messy. You can totally learn to do it with a knife. It's tricky. I even struggle with it, but I honestly will often resort to using the knife to get the bulk of the peanut butter onto the toast and then using a finger to sort of spread it out more evenly. It's the most tactile way of doing things. And I have a feeling that in the questions you're going to ask me, you're going to see I do a lot of things just with my hands because your hands are your best tools. They're incredibly tactile. You can feel everything that you're doing. Feel the weight, the texture, the temperature. They're incredibly valuable. It's kind of unconventional when you're blind and using your hands as much as you are. They are your best tools and you have to utilize them.
Right. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but when you're doing blind cooking, you're using your hands whether you like it or not. And that also means having peanut butter on your hands after you've tried to butter your toast with it.
And I am washing my hands constantly. It's really annoying, but I'm lucky that I have a small kitchen so I don't have to run across the room to go and wash my hands. I'm rinsing my hands every 20 seconds. This is not even an exaggeration.
That's totally fair because you don't want like peanut butter getting mixed with, I don't know, oil or something. That wouldn't really make for a tasty meal. Speaking of using your hands for different things, I mean, with peanut butter, there's not much danger there, right? But when it comes to things like the oven or the stovetop, anything that requires heat, how do you not burn yourself if you have to touch your food?
Yeah, there's the fear of burning your food, and then there's the fear of burning yourself, and then there's the fear of burning your entire house down. And the way you get over that is by understanding how fires start, how you burn yourself. And I think the best thing to do is to really learn your tools, understand your stovetop, and be very mindful of what temperatures your pans can handle without them sputtering a ton and shooting oil all over the place. Or understanding at what temperature you can actually touch your pan, because I will occasionally just put my hand directly in a pan with sauteing onions to sort of feel them up. Not all the time, but I do feel like it's one of the best ways to do it. The other thing is you can burn yourself. You're not going to die. You're gonna be fine. And if you burn yourself once or twice in the process of learning how to pull something in and out of the oven, then so be it. Now, that said, you have tools at your disposal. If you have really good oven mitts, you're not gonna burn yourself. Put oven mitts on and start touching the rack of the oven while it's been on for a little while. You'll see you're totally fine. Oven mitts can handle incredibly high temperatures. You're going to be totally fine. Well, when you're pulling something in and out of the oven, just line yourself up nicely. Don't drop whatever you're carrying. You're going to be fine.
I think you're right. I think there's a lot that goes into understanding how your tools work. And this is just an idea that popped into my mind right now. But what if someone was to, let's say, obviously with the oven off, feel the inside of their oven so they understand what the layout is like.
That's a really good idea.
This way, when they are putting something in the oven, they kind of know, okay, here's where the element is, how high it is, or how low it is. So next time they go to put something in, they already have an idea of where they're heading with the plate.
I also will tend to, say if I'm putting like a cookie sheet in the oven, I'll purposely take the sheet and sort of touch both sides of the oven. And that helps me line myself up. I don't just go in there without touching it, because then I have no point of reference as to where the door actually is. And I do something similar with the air fryer, where if I'm putting my hand inside the air fryer to pull out whatever, I'm going to take like tongs and touch the sides to give myself a better idea of where the sides are. Because if you touch them, you can burn yourself. So use the tools at your disposal to like understand where the hot elements are.
Now, I'd also be curious to ask you, because you talk about not starting fires by understanding what you're working with, and the fact that you can touch things even though you do occasionally, burn yourself. But obviously it's hot, right? It's going to be maybe uncomfortable for like a second. But when you started cooking, were you ever scared of burning yourself?
Oh, yeah. There's certain things that are kind of sketchy. Say I'm pulling out like a chicken roast, like a whole chicken, and it's really sizzling, and it's just like in a roasting pan. That stuff feels like you could drop it easily if you don't have a good grip, and then your arms are right next to hot metal that could burn you. It is scary, I'm not gonna lie, but you pick up on techniques that make you feel a little safer. And sometimes you might feel like you're pulling things out of the oven a little funky. Like that same roasting pan that I'm thinking about right now, it's longer than it is deep, right? And so when I'm pulling it out, I'm not keeping my arms like as wide as the pan are. I sort of pull one side of the pan out closer towards the center of the door so that I don't have to have my arms as wide as possible. I sort of re-angle it so that I stay away from the elements as much as possible. I think a sighted person could just line themselves up easily. I take the safest path to do it.
That is totally fair. It's all about A, understanding your tools, and B, kind of coming up with your own little tricks and skills to...
your adaptations. And sometimes they can be very weird.
Absolutely. But hey, it ends up being the same result, right? You're still getting things out of the oven, so successful in my book. From one topic that requires your hands to another, let's talk about cutting food, like chopping vegetables, cutting bread, cutting meat. How do you do that? How do you not cut yourself? Because I know that one thing that I feel like people with sight always worry about when they see a blind person cooking is when said blind person has a knife in their hands and they are about to, let's say, cut vegetables for a salad. I think as blind people, we probably, all of us heard our parents tell us, hey, careful, the knife is sharp, or
they might not want you to do it in the first place. They might stop you from doing it. And then you come to adulthood and you never cut a vegetable, which is a real problem. And the way you do it safely is, I kind of think of it as parallel lines that should never cross. That's how you should think of it in your mind, as parallel lines. The first line is your fingertips of the thing that you're holding. Say you're cutting a cucumber. You form a line with your fingertips. You don't hold the vegetable with your palm. You want to hold it down with your fingertips, and to be mindful where your fingertips are. That sounds kind of funny. And then holding the knife, preferably a big one, in my opinion. I actually find it safer. And remembering that the blade is perfectly straight. It's perfectly lined up with the handle. It might as well be a laser. That's how precise it is. And you can even cut vegetables by pressing the blade against your knuckles as like a guide. And then because you can really feel the weight of the knife, especially when you get used to it, you can be very confident in knowing that you're not going to cut your fingers because you're picturing that parallel, but you're also getting the feedback of the knife, the weight of the knife, and just knowing where your fingertips are intuitively. The other thing is using a nice sharp knife is always safer. Might seem counterintuitive, but using a sharp knife is always better because if it's dull, it can slip, right? And that thing that I'm telling you about holding vegetables with your fingertips, that's just good culinary advice in the first place. Like all sighted chefs do that. So there really aren't blind specific tricks there aren't too many blind specific tricks for cutting and using a cutting board that I can offer you. Because good cutting technique is good cutting technique.
I think another thing that you mentioned that is important to keep in mind, I believe, is to use a cutting board. Because sometimes people will take vegetables and, just put them on a plate and then start cutting the vegetables on the plate. But a plate can be slippery. A counter can be slippery.
You'll damage your plate too.
Exactly. And like a cutting board, it's a bit more rough. It'll hold your vegetable in place. Obviously, you still have to hold it down with your fingertips, like you said, but it has less chances of just like moving around.
Of course.
And that alone kind of helps you stay aligned and know where you're going with your knife. So I feel like when it comes to cooking, it's really a matter of good spatial awareness of your hands, if that makes sense.
Exactly. I mean, that's really the only thing that we blind people need to be aware of when we're using a knife in the kitchen. All of the other things that will make you able to cut when you're totally blind is the regular advice that you'll see for using a knife in the kitchen. So if you go online and look up how to chop vegetables, all that advice is going to be perfectly applicable to you.
Mm-hmm. Now, from cutting vegetables to not burning ourselves to something else that people do pretty regularly. Let's say you want to pour yourself a drink or a cup of coffee in the morning or a glass of juice. How do you know when to stop pouring liquids if you cannot see the top of your cup or your glass? How do you prevent your liquid from overflowing and end up with a huge mess in the kitchen?
Okay, yeah. This it depends on the liquid. Say you're pouring milk out of a bag. That could be kind of tricky. But because it's cold, that makes it a lot easier. This is the dirty way of doing it. Just put a finger on the rim of your glass. Yep. And then pour, and then once you feel the liquid touch your finger, boom, it's at the top. Alternatively, you can use a liquid level indicator, which is a little thing that rests on the rim of your cup. And once it feels liquid on both its little prongs, it starts beeping and vibrating. It's super straightforward. That's the type of thing that you would use mostly for hot liquids, like if you're pouring a tea, for example. There are other situations where you can feel very confident that it's not going to overflow. Saying you're dumping liquid from a big bowl, say you're dumping liquid from a medium bowl into a big bowl, it's not going to overflow. That's literally impossible. That's kind of the situation with my coffee maker. The coffee maker cannot hold more liquid than my cup can. And so I just don't have to worry about it, even though it's a hot liquid.
Right. And I mean, you really just got to find what works best for you, I find, in a situation like this. I do know that some people really like using a liquid label indicator. A lot of people really swear by just doing it by putting a finger.
Or by weight. If you get used to cups, or if you feel confident enough, you can just do it by weight when it feels full.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's also a very good way to know for sure. Let's get back to the oven and the stovetop. When you are cooking meat, for example, things like sauteed onions, like you said, can be a bit more forgiven in this situation. But when it comes to meat, and obviously you don't want your meat to be undercooked because that can be dangerous. How can you tell when you're blind when things are cooked and when they're safe to be eaten?
If you're a beginner, you kind of need a talking meat thermometer. There's no way around it. I know that I've personally made chicken and maybe I took a couple risks, because overcooked chicken is really dry and not especially palatable. But sometimes you just kind of have to, just because you don't want to eat raw chicken, obviously. But the meat thermometer is what's going to let you make chicken that's actually edible. There is a tendency, and I know that a lot of blind people will do this, is to basically cook things a lot more than they need to, cook meat a lot more than they need to, just because they absolutely do not want to be eating raw meat. The answer is a talking meat thermometer. The other thing is, eventually, once you start cooking a lot, you can feel very confident that something is cooked just through intuition. You're putting something in the oven. I don't know. I know for a fact that if I put 2 chicken breasts in the oven for 20 minutes at 425 degrees, they're going to be probably pretty dry. That's way too much. That's way too long. I know that through intuition because I've done that before. You pick up on these things after a little while. And that goes for any trick, anything in the kitchen. Experience is invaluable in cooking.
Absolutely. And let's touch on the talking meat thermometer. This is a great example of how technology can be so useful in the kitchen when you're cooking as a blind person.
Yeah, no kidding.
You have been using a talking meat thermometer called Chef IQ. Would you like to talk about that just very briefly?
Yeah, I think it's called the Chef IQ Sense. And it's this little platform thing, and inside it is a prong, maybe about 4 or 5 inches long. And before you put your meat in the oven, you poke it so that the tip of the prong is in the thickest part of your meat. And once you pop it in the oven, like the prong goes in the oven as well, inside the chicken, or inside whatever meat you want, honestly. You can connect to an app which will tell you the temperature in real time, and you can enter in what type of meat it is, what type of cut if you want to. Even if you're using the air fryer or the oven, it'll tell you what the target temperature is and send you a notification when to pull it out. So basically it handles the checking for doneness itself. It's fantastic. And the benefit of that is that you get perfectly tender chicken like every time. It's amazing, invaluable resource. But there are a lot of talking meat thermometers out there.
I can definitely attest to that. And it's really cool how it'll tell you, okay, resting time has started for your meat. Or it even tells you when you need to flip your food.
Yeah, that's
which
right.
I think is amazing. Now, you are a great cook. and
Thank you.
And you have been cooking for a long time. But I'm pretty sure that there are things that maybe you still kind of feel on the fence trying, which brings me to my next question, which is, are there any techniques or recipes that you do not do? And I would be curious to know, what makes you decide? Is it the risk factor of, let's say, burning yourself, or handling certain foods or elements of the recipe that are simply not blind friendly?
I can think of 2 right now, 2 examples. The first one is oil. Say, like pan-fried chicken in oil. That's a no for me. It's too spluttery. If the pan gets too hot, the oil can ignite. I am not dealing with that. I can feel very safe in putting something in the oven. I don't feel especially safe dealing with oil at high temperatures on a pan. When you're sauteing vegetables and onions, you don't need to put it at the highest temperature. And besides, you have like a tablespoon of oil in there. If you're doing anything where you need, like 1 or 2 centimeters of oil at the bottom to do like a sort of fry situation, no, I'm not dealing with that. It's not worth it. It's too messy, too hot. Even just the splutters can seriously burn you, and there's like not much you can do about it. It's the type of thing that's very visual too, because you can only tell when it's ready by like the color of it. You can't reasonably use a talking meat thermometer in that sort of situation. Now, the other thing is, if I'm making like a whole chicken, to go back to that example again, some recipes will tell you to flip it halfway through. That can be really hard. I've tried to do that with a turkey once, and it's one of those things that's like, you will make a giant hot mess if you try to do that. And I just say, it's not worth it. Screw it. I'm not going to do it. Really, the oil example is the main thing that I will stay away from. Everything else, I feel fairly confident in at least attempting.
Right. And I'd also be curious to know, let's say, okay, cooking with oil might be a no because of the risk of burning yourself.
I'll say like a lot of oil. Obviously, you're going to cook with oil. Oil goes in everything. I mean, like deep frying, that sort of situation.
Okay, fair point. I was just going to ask, if you have a recipe in front of you that you really want to try, you're like, this would taste so good, but you do not want to do it because it involves using a lot of oil. Can you sometimes look at alternatives? And how easy is it to find alternatives to recipes that you don't want to do because they can be kind of sketchy?
Oh, that's a good question. I've attempted to make naan before, and you make the dough. That's not a problem. It's very tactile. There's no hot elements or anything. But when you go to cook it, the typical way you would do it is make it directly in a pan, like no oil as far as I understand, but directly in a really, really, really hot pan. I didn't really want to do that because you have to use the hottest possible setting, and it can bubble up and it can be fast and it's really easy to burn. And the signs that it's ready are very visual. And because you're at like the hottest temperature, you can't reasonably put your fingers in there and feel how it feels. Sometimes I will try to put my hands like on the bread, on the dough part, which you can touch, but now I'm really risking it. The alternative there is to sort of bake them in the oven at a hot temperature. Not ideal, really not ideal. But I would rather keep my house intact and have naan than burn it down and not have naan anyways.
That is totally fair. I would also like it if you could keep our house standing and not burn to the ground.
I'll do my best.
Now, I'm pretty sure that organization in the kitchen, just like in a lot of things in life, is key, right? Especially when you are cooking and you are moving fast and you need a lot of things in a recipe, whether it be spices or different, like, I don't know, oils. How do you organize things in your kitchen? And especially, how do you recognize your spices and your bottles of liquids? How do you differentiate when you cannot see them?
When you're blind, you become very attuned to the little differences in all your objects. I'm not confusing my phone for a bar of soap. Like they're very different. And same goes for bottles, right? My jug of vinegar is plastic. There's no other thing in the kitchen that feels like that. My balsamic vinegar comes in a tall, skinny glass bottle. I have no other thing that feels like that. And even if I do have another thing that feels like that, say it's like a apple cider vinegar, I know that bottle is one of two things. So then I can just pop open the lid, give it a smell. Oh, that's apple cider. Okay, perfect. Moving on. So that applies to spices too. You can have all sorts of different jars, different shapes of jars. And I made an effort to go out to Dollarama and buy all sorts of little glass mason jars, but make sure they came in different shapes. So I have these like big round ones, some with like almost like an octagonal shape, some are squarish, different types of lids. And over time, I just sort of remember which are which. If I forget what's in there, I can give it a shake. If I feel like it's a bunch of chunky stuff, okay, that feels like some sort of spice, some sort of seed, some sort of whole spice. It's not a powder. And then I go and shake another one, and I feel that it's powder, so it's clearly some sort of spice mix or something like that. So you narrow it down quickly. And then you have things you use all the time, like salt. I just leave a pot of salt out on the counter constantly. And for herbs and stuff, they can go in, little mason jars. And if you want to differentiate them, even if they're identical jars, you can put things alphabetically. You can put things by sort of category, Sometimes I'll put my more traditional, like Western European herbs, like oregano and thyme and rosemary all together. That, like, logically, that makes sense in my head to have those stuck together. The obvious thing is to put Braille labels. And I know there's some more technological solutions to storage. I've tried Braille labels in the past. I don't think they're for me. They're just not fast enough. I feel like a lot of people can just remember what's where better than reading the lid of every single thing. I feel like that's just kind of slow. In practice, it's a little slow. Eventually, you'll just memorize where everything is anyways. That doesn't mean that brailing is a bad idea, because sometimes you do forget, but most of the time you can just get to it easily. One thing you'll realize with storage is that you will value your drawers more than you will your cupboards, because when you're reaching into cupboards, you can knock stuff over. It can fall out of the way, and things that are in the back, you can't reach easily. When you're pulling things out of drawers, you can't knock things out of them. And if there's something in the back, you can access them just as easily as the stuff in the front. So I have all my spices in a drawer, and I can reach everything perfectly.
That is so true. And I never thought about this, but it makes a lot of sense. And I mean, if you're not super tall like me, it's even sketchier to go and reach for things in cupboards that are
so much more accessible.
Yeah, and things that are like so far, deep that you're like, oh my gosh, I'm just going to knock over everything that's around it. And going back to labeling, spice jars with Braille, I can totally see both sides to this, how slow it can be. I think when you get very, very familiar with your spices and you kind of know what you're looking for and what you need. But I can also see how for someone who is starting, getting used to cooking and all that, I think it's a great way to maybe associate the word to maybe the smell, or like you said, if you shake the jar, what it feels like. So I think if you are starting, Braille is a great way to familiarize yourself, and then as you're getting better and as you're getting more familiar with the different spices and you feel more confident, then you can, let's say, remove the Braille if you wish to.
That's really smart, because you can also associate it with smell, right? If
Absolutely.
You're not familiar with oregano, like you have the oregano jar, you can feel the Braille on top, smell it, and then you associate that smell with oregano moving forward, That makes a lot of sense. That's really good.
Exactly. That's just a little trick right there. And speaking of tricks and tips, this brings me to my last question. As an experienced blind cook, what are your tips and tricks for the blind people who want to start cooking?
This is advice that you see in cooking generally in the mainstream, and has nothing to do with being blind. And that's to learn techniques instead of recipes. Because cooking is not about executing recipes, it's about executing techniques. By that I mean making a sauce and reducing it, or sauteing onions until brown. You're gonna make a lot of recipes where you need to saute onions until they're brown. So you should get used to that. Techniques include cutting those onions. They include knowing that when you're throwing chopped garlic into a pan of sauteing onions, you put the onions first and wait until they're soft until you throw the garlic. Otherwise, you're going to burn the garlic, because the garlic it burns a lot faster than onions do. It's learning techniques, and all these things come together so that eventually you'll see new recipes and you can tell if you could do it easily because you're familiar with the techniques. And those techniques include the adaptations that you've done for yourself because you're blind. The specific ways that you do things to adapt things for yourself. And so learn techniques instead of recipes.
Would you say that in cooking there are a lot of like transferable skills from like one technique to another, one recipe to another, and that's why techniques are more, I want to say, important than actual recipes?
Definitely. Being familiar with palates and being able to taste something and say, oh, it's missing this. It actually could use a bit of sugar. This is too salty. Let's add a little bit of acidity to knock that down. That sort of thing. Or knowing that if we're making a sandwich, like, it's going to get real soggy unless the bread is toasted. And so you can toast like that one side of the bread so that it doesn't get soggy. All that stuff is transferable when you're making other types of recipes. Say you're making bruschetta. Well, I don't want it to get soggy. I'm also going to toast the bread here. Like, all this stuff is transferable. When you're boiling pasta, it's very similar to boiling couscous. It's all these things. You're often using the same tools, just slightly different methodology. It's all transferable. And the more techniques you learn, the more likely you are to be open to learning new ones.
Absolutely. And cooking is a lot of fun. It's kind of like this thing where you start doing it once and then you're successful at the recipe that you're trying, and then it makes you want to do more, right? Because you're like, oh, I managed to do this one. Maybe I can do another one. And speaking of, starting to cook, we touched on this a little bit earlier, but when we were talking about, sometimes we have our sighted parents or siblings or people in our circle that look at us, like we said, with a knife in our hands and go, be careful, you are going to cut yourself. Don't do that. I'll do it for you. I think, and I would be so curious to know your thoughts on this, but I think that the main thing when it comes to wanting to start cooking is to actually do it, to take that step and to take a knife and, I don't know, cut vegetables for salad. And even if somebody comes up to you being like, hey, it's okay, I'll do it for you, to kind of stand up for yourself and say, no, it's okay, I've got this, I know how to do it, I will be careful.
It's tempting to accept everybody's help when it's given to you, but as a blind person, you have to stand your ground and say, no, I want to do this myself. This is important to me. I'm cutting the vegetables for the salad today. You have to start somewhere. And if it means just cutting vegetables to get used to, like, knife skills, then so be it. Start slow.
Exactly. And it'll be so valuable later on. And cooking
right. Because you have to eat. You can't order in all the time. Like, cooking is not just a hobby. It's actually a really important skill. If you want to live on your own, you have to know how to cook. You don't need to know how to make a 3-course meal and 5 Michelin stars. You just need to be able to make things that are healthy and palatable to you and not burn your house down in the process.
Exactly. It doesn't have to be anything super fancy, and the bar doesn't need to be set super high. You don't need the most flavorful meal out there. You just want something to survive, and that starts with small steps. This has been super informative. Thank you so much for your answers and for taking time to being part of our podcast.
Happy to be part of it.
Cooking and baking are very similar in a lot of ways, and yet they also require different skill set. To talk with us about what it's like to bake blind is one of our If You Can't See hosts, Henna. Henna, let me start by asking you this question. How is baking different than cooking?
So baking is different because it's more science-based. You need to be very direct to the point of measuring ingredients. For cooking, it's like whatever you can put, whatever type of ingredients. You don't have to follow a recipe directly.
I guess the thing with cooking is, for example, when a recipe calls for a pinch of salt, right? That's very easy to do. I mean, you can very much eyeball it, right? Just take a little bit of salt in your fingers and then put it in your food. And then a lot of recipes will also say like salt and pepper to taste, right? So you can add salt and pepper if you want to. You can omit them. It won't really make a difference, right? It's more to add flavor. And correct me here if I'm wrong, but baking requires measurements, right? Because like you said, it's science-based. So chemistry plays a huge role. Wouldn't you say so?
Yes, that's correct. Like, when a recipe says like you need 1 cup, you gotta make sure it's level and to the T of 1 cup. If it's any extra or any under, it will mess up the recipe completely.
Right, and I can attest to that myself because once I was baking some muffins and the recipe called for, I don't want to say something that's not true here, but I believe it was like a half a teaspoon or a quarter teaspoon of salt. And I was not careful with my measuring spoons and I put a whole teaspoon of salt in the muffins. And you can imagine that the muffins came out a lot saltier than they needed to be. So you definitely have to properly measure out your ingredients if you do not want to end up with a recipe that's not exactly what you were intended for. Now, speaking of recipes, when people cook, at least from what I've seen, they don't really follow the recipe as they go. Again, because like you said, it's straightforward, it's very direct. However, baking is a little different with all the measurements and all the things that you have to keep in mind so you don't mess it up. How do you manage reading a recipe while baking at the same time?
So what I do is I find my recipes a few days before. Once I find a good recipe, then I type it out and I take all the garbage out of the recipe so it's directly to the T of the ingredients and the directions. And then I just memorize the measurements like 1 cup for butter, maybe 1 cup of sugar, half a cup of brown sugar, 2 eggs, a teaspoon of vanilla, half teaspoon of salt, and then I just memorize it. And then the next day, I will just know what ingredients and the right measurements.
Wow, you're able to memorize entire baking recipes?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, because I can't do that. When I choose a recipe, Jacob and I bake a lot. We love baking. And I mean, to be to be fair here, he's the one who finds the recipes and he will forward them to me via email. But there is no way that I can remember all the measurements. I find myself constantly having to look at my phone to make sure that I am doing the right things and putting in the right amount of flour, putting in the right amount of baking powder, baking soda, etc. Do you ever use your phone while you're baking? I know you said that you memorize recipes, but do you ever find yourself having to use your phone? And if you do, how do you read through the recipe?
Okay, so before I start baking, I will go over the recipe, make sure I have all the ingredients. I would measure all the ingredients out so I know I have the ingredients, and if an ingredient is missing, then I know and then I won't make it. And how I read my recipes is that I use a screen reader called VoiceOver and magnification together, and that's how I read my recipes.
Oh, that's interesting. So you actually measure out your ingredients, even like all of your ingredients, even before you start baking?
Yes, that's correct. Because one time I was gonna go bake a recipe, and I think it was cookies, and I didn't have no eggs or no flour, and I already start baking it, and measuring the
Oh no.
ingredients, and then I noticed, oh, I don't have no flour, I have no eggs, so I had no eggs, so then I have to stop making it and tell my and someone who's sighted can go get me the ingredients, and then I remake it. But it's better to make sure you have all the ingredients laid out and measure so you have the right measurements.
Absolutely, yeah, because that definitely happened to us too, where we wanted to bake and kind of like halfway through the recipe, we realized like, oh, we are out of this thing. And then we either have to look for a substitute to that thing or just stop making the recipe altogether. And it's actually smart, I think, to measure out your things before you start mixing them. I know for me, I will sort of like measure things out as I go. So if it calls for a cup of flour, I will do a cup of flour, then half a cup of, let's say, brown sugar. And sometimes you do need to reuse a certain cup. So obviously you can't measure it out like all at once because if you only have 1 cup, then you can't do like 2 cups of two different things. But I totally see how that would be very useful. Now, if we stay on the topic of baking recipes, I noticed that a lot of them will tell you in the instructions to look at the dough or the batter and only put it in the oven when everything is well mixed together, when all the ingredients are well incorporated. My question for you is when you cannot see that, because to me that's something very visual when they say that. You have to look and make sure that, there are no chunks of this or that, and that it looks a certain way. But when you cannot see, how do you know when your batter or when your dough is ready?
Okay, so for me, any recipe or baked good that I make, I don't do it by hand. I use a KitchenAid mixer, just because of vision loss, and you don't know if all the ingredients are incorporated together. So once it's done, then I take the paddle off and I kind of like feel it with my hands or taste it, and then like okay, it's done. Or another option is like you can hear like if the sugar's still like grimy in the bottom of the bowl, that means like the butter and sugar is not mixed together.
Huh, interesting. So you kind of rely on tactile feedback, right?
Yes.
That's interesting. And you mentioned like a mixer. How easy do you find using the mixer blind? Do you find that it's relatively easy? Do you find that it does a good job? Do you still feel like you need to touch your batter to make sure that it did it well, or is it just so good that you don't even have to double check?
So with the KitchenAid mixer, it does a really good job. As a blind person, it's something I really rely on because doing it by hand or just mixing by a mixing bowl, you never know if all the ingredients are incorporated and mixed together. With the KitchenAid mixer, you can like turn it on and it just does the work, and then okay, 100% the ingredients are incorporated all together.
It's also a lot faster, I would assume, right, to use a mixer instead of just doing it by hand.
Yes, that's correct.
Now, we're talking about dough and batter being ready. But then once that's in the oven, you have to wait, obviously, for your mixture to bake. Now, how do you know if what you're baking is ready when you pull it out of the oven? Because obviously, you do not want to end up with, let's say, cookies that are undercooked. I mean, you can still eat them, right? It'll still just be good, tasty dough, right? But you don't want to make undercooked cookies. So, how do you know when what you're baking is ready?
So how I know when my cookies are ready out of the oven is that like I set a timer like whatever it says on the recipe on my phone, and then I pull them out, and if I don't think they're ready, then like if there is a sighted person around, I would ask. If not, then I would call like an app called Be My Eyes, get a sighted volunteer to tell them, are these golden brown? Are they crispy on the edges?
Interesting. Do you ever use tactile feedback? Is there any way that you could know if they're ready just by using your hands and your sense of touch? Obviously, having someone sighted is easy because they can just look at it, right? It's a very easy hint, right? When you see that, like, oh, your cookies are like a golden brown, or like you said, they look crispy. But let's say that you don't have anyone sighted around. Can you just by touch know if they are ready or not?
Yes. So if the cookies are like really soft and like not hard around the edges, that means they're still undercooked. And so just to put them back in like for maybe 1 or 2 minutes and then it should be done.
Right. That makes total sense. I'm curious to know, is it the same thing for cakes? Does the same rule apply that you don't want it to be soft in the middle, or you want it to obviously maybe not look a certain way because it's not going to be golden, but what rules apply for cakes, or is it the same as cookies?
Okay, so when you're making a cake, it's completely different. When you're taking a cake out, and you have to put like a toothpick in the center of the cake, and if it comes out clear, that means it's cooked. If the toothpick and if you feel dough on it, that means it still needs to go back into the oven.
Oh, that's so interesting. So, when it comes to cakes, it's not so much visual. You literally have a tool to help you figure out if the cake is done baking or not. So, I'm guessing, and correct me here if I'm wrong, but I'm guessing you could just touch the little thing that you mentioned or to feel for dough, right?
Yes, that's correctly. Like it doesn't also have to be like a toothpick. You can also put like a butter knife in the center of the cake. The same method. If it comes out clear, that means it's done. If there's still dough on it, it means it has to go back in.
That's amazing because it's super tactile. Again, you can just feel for if there's dough on it. Now, we're talking about the oven, putting things in the oven. You mentioned taking things out of the oven, cookies, cakes. I asked Jacob this question, how he takes things out of the oven and how he puts things in and how he, manages to not burn himself. I'd be curious to hear your way of doing things. How do you not burn yourself when you put your baked goods in the oven and when you pull them out?
So my method of like putting baked goods into the oven is that I get two mitten gloves and I open the oven lid like completely, and then I line myself up in the center, and then I put it into the middle of the rack and push it all the way back, and then pull it a little bit forward so it's center in the oven. That's how I put my stuff in the oven, and then when it's done and taking it out, I do the same thing, and then I put it like on a surface where it won't like continue to cook.
Right, absolutely. Because just like we talked about baking undercooked cookies, you don't want to overcook your cookies or your cakes. Speaking of techniques, in this case, we talked about not burning yourself, but if we get back to more baking specifics, what are, if there are any, what are some baking techniques that you would never do for various reasons, but because they are a little sketch to do blind?
Some of the techniques that I will never do by myself is doing a double boiler. What that means is having a pot on the stove with water in it, letting it boil, and then put another bowl on top of it. For example, if you're making ganache and you want the chocolate and cream to melt together, you gotta put it on a double boiler. But for my safety, it's too dangerous, so I would never do it.
That's totally fair. You do not want to burn yourself, right, with hot boiling water. And because this is a little dangerous, is there any alternative that you can do to execute this technique? Or is it just something that cannot be replaced and you just do not do it at all and you would rather have help from someone or let someone else do it?
I would never do this because I don't feel safe in myself. For making ganache, that's the only option to do it. But for another alternative, for like making brownies, you can melt the chocolate chips in the microwave in a safe microwave bowl.
That's totally fair. Let's go back to cakes for a second. Um, One thing that I find to be a little tricky when baking cakes as a blind or low vision person is, let's say you want to be fancy and you want to make a really nice cake and you want to put icing on your cake. Now, icing comes in different ways, but how do you manage putting icing on your cake? Because it can easily become a huge mess.
This is a huge challenge for me. Putting icing on a cake is not easy, but if there is a cheap pan like cake that's like only one layer, then it's like easy for me to spread icing because it's all one level. And how I will do is like spread it all in the middle and then do it to the right until the edge, and then do it to the left to the edge, and then it's completely done.
Do you use your finger for that, or do you use a tool like a spoon or, I don't know, like a butter knife or something? What's the easiest way and most accessible way to do that?
I would use a spatula and then also use my fingers, but then it's kind of messy and it's kind of uneven, and your fingerprints are all over the cake.
Oh, yeah, that's a good point actually, because a cake is not as solid as let's say, cookies or muffins, right? So can be a lot more crumbly. So if you start messing around with the icing and moving it around with your finger, yeah, you risk messing up the cake and maybe like poking holes in it. And obviously, you don't want to be doing that. My next question for you is, do you use any assistive technology while baking? I know Jacob talked about a talking meat thermometer, but how does technology help with baking if you use any?
I use a talking scale that has four different buttons and units. One is gram, ounces, fluid ounces, and I don't know the last one. But the main two ones I use when I make my baked goods are the grams and ounces. So once you put something on the surface, you press here, and then whatever you weigh, like sugar in a bowl, it will tell you like how many grams. I got 100 grams. Until you get to the correct grams, that's what I use for technology when making my baked goods. Another piece of technology I use is a talking thermometer to measure water to get to the correct temperature to Celsius.
Right, because I imagine that just like the right amount of ingredients when we talked earlier about measurements, just like that is important. I would imagine that the right water temperature is also very important, right?
Yes, it is. It's not that important when making baked goods, but like when making yeast or bread, then it's like when you really need to have the correct temperature for the yeast to rise and to make the peppermint.
Right, just goes to show how precise you need to be when baking. Again, because the smallest little difference in the recipe that you're doing could change the entire result of what you are trying to bake. I would be curious to know, what is the most difficult thing to bake as a blind person? We've talked about cookies, and I think those are relatively easy. Cakes are probably a bit more complicated, but it sounds like you've mastered cakes. But for you personally, what's the most difficult thing to bake?
The most difficult thing for me to make is a pie from scratch. For a blind person, just starting off as baking is very complicated because you gotta make sure the dough is rolled enough and stretched out to put in the pie shell, and then you have to blind bake it, put beans on it, blind bake it, and then make sure it comes out and it's not over burned, and then making the pie filling. I think this is more complicated because it has a lot of steps to it.
Right. I can totally see that. Is there any way that this can be sort of like adapted? Or is it just, to you at least, considered a bit too much or maybe too much effort?
So for me, because I have practiced this over time, pies are not that more complicated. But maybe someone starting off from a beginner level might think of it. And how I made it more adaptable, like, is getting pie shells like already pre-made, and so then you just have to make whatever pie filling you want to fill your shells with.
That's a great idea. Sort of like start with something that's kind of like half pre-made, like you said, like the crust or the dough, if you will. So you can only focus on the filling. And then once you have mastered the filling, then you can move on to learning how to make your pie crust and everything. That's a great idea. Sort of like work your way up one step at a time. And I am going to conclude on the topic of advice. What advice would you give a blind person who wants to try baking?
So, for some advice I would give someone just starting off baking is try something simple and incorporate your techniques or methods of just simply in the kitchen and use your tools and technique and just advance on your skills and be more comfortable when you're baking. I say a simple recipe to start off is with a cookies.
Right, cookies are super simple to make and they take so little time. I mean, in 10 minutes, your cookies are going to be ready. And who doesn't love cookies, right? And I mean, there are so many recipes to choose from. And again, even with cookies, I find it doesn't have to be a super complex recipe. You don't have to start right away with chocolate chips or oats or raisins. Just a simple recipe where you learn the basics of baking, like putting dry ingredients together, putting wet ingredients together, but in another bowl. Why is that? That's a great advice. Starting easy and then working your way up, I think, is the main takeaway. Baking and cooking as well. This was super informative and super interesting. And I would like to thank you so much for being part of this baking episode. Thank you, Henna.
You're welcome.
And that's it for today's episode. I hope you learned a little more about how blind people use their kitchens. Stay tuned for the next episode of If You Can't See. I'm your host, Ariana. Thanks for listening.